Thank you very much to Dr. Milani for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be back at Stanford. It's a great pleasure to talk in the Iranian Studies series. Thank you very much, of course, also to Roma Parhad and to Franco Erico for all of the organization that goes into these kinds of events. What I'm going to present to you tonight, and there'll be a series of slides with quotations, some of which I will discuss, others are there for you to read as I talk about the issues that are pertinent to those poems and to those excerpts. This is based around part of my recent book that Roma just mentioned, and it was really at Stanford that I feel I understood what I really wanted my book to be, and that came out of partly the teaching that I did that here at Stanford, because I was within a comparative literature department and not in the kind of equivalent of a NELC or an area studies, Middle Eastern, Near Eastern studies department, that I think I had to think about the way in which I wanted to discuss Hafez in a slightly broader context, but also it was through the interactions with colleagues in comparative literature, in the broader DLCL, the Division of Literatures, Cultures and Languages, but also people who were great colleagues and close friends in history and in religious studies, and those who are involved in the Iranian Studies program, that I feel the book that I'm going to talk about and from tonight really came into being. So it's wonderful to be back at Stanford and talking about my recent published work. Lauded and genius who really is inimitable by literary critics of the past and held up by scholars of the present as a poet who defies comparison with others, Shamsuddin Muhammad Hafiz Shirazi, who died in approximately 1390, remains an opaque character for many. Soon after his death, Hafiz the poet and or his poems started being referred to as Lisan al-Ghaib, or the tongue of the unseen realm. As early as 1421, Hafiz's ghazals, which are short, monorhyme, broadly amorous but not exclusively amorous lyric poems, were called the envy of the source of eternal life and were said to be endowed with the power to revive the expired heart, just like the magical breaths of Jesus. In my new book, I present the poetry of Hafiz as part of a larger organic whole, and I believe to look behind the hyperbole that surrounds Hafiz's poetry and penetrate the saint-like film that obscures the poet himself. For that purpose, I've adopted a comparative approach. I believe wholeheartedly that there is great value in analyzing Hafiz's poetry alongside texts that were composed by those working in the same highly competitive, profoundly intertextual environment of 14th century Shiraz. And you can see from this map of the Iranian plateau, but also going into what is modern-day Iraq, the position of Shiraz vis-a-vis other cities I'm going to mention. Hafiz and his peers imitated one another's poems, responded to each other repeatedly in verse, and vied to outdo one another in the hope of securing lucrative patronage. As such, their poetry demands to be analysed in tandem, and it is only through a comparative textual study that this at once loco-specific, trans-regional, and intergeneric poetry and poetic environment that a nuanced and altogether more balanced picture of Hafiz will emerge. Mine is a study of Persian poetry at a specific historical juncture in a particular place, that is post-Mongol Shiraz, a city of approximately 60,000 people that had immense cultural reach. My analysis of Hafiz and the other poets of Shiraz is presented within the broader context of a trans-regional literary network that stretched across the major cities of 14th century Iran and Iraq, which shared a common poetic idiom. By focusing on a large network of Persian poets that were active from about 1330 to 1400 across Shiraz, Kerman, Yazd, Baghdad and Tabriz, I reread Hafiz through a sober lens and with keen attention to his contemporary literary context. My study embraces the conscious and deliberate hybridity and ambiguity of the Persian ghazal. And though I place emphasis on the profane, I in no way seek to deny the mystical depth of this poetic form. That said, the late Yar Shater did well to remind us that Hafiz's cultural climate, though it was saturated with mystical thought, then the currency of such ideas and expressions did not entail a deliberate attachment to Sufi tenets or practices. Just because something sounds mystical or looks mystical doesn't necessarily mean that it is intended to be so. We must also acknowledge that Hafiz and his contemporaries wrote with a variety of contexts in mind, and that their sophisticated interlocutors, many of whom, including a number of royal patrons, wrote poetry themselves, that these people were capable of understanding a given ghazal on multiple levels. Whether we wish to label Hafiz as a professional court poet or not, we cannot deny that he was a major player within Shiraz's socio-political fabric, and that he enjoyed largely nourishing relationships with a long line of local rulers, and relationships that were perhaps slightly less direct with the elites of Baghdad and Tabriz. These two cities at the time were Shiraz's most significant cultural and political competitors. Very little reliable information exists about the life of Hafiz. Born around 1320 in Shiraz to a local mother and a father of Esfahani stock, Hafiz appears to have received a solid education in the Islamic sciences. In his youth, the poet earned the right to use the title Hafiz, which denotes one who has memorized the Quran by heart, hence his pen name. Although even in this pen name, there is a typically Hafizian ambiguity, since the term Hafiz also means a professional musician or singer. Hafiz died in Shiraz in or just before 1390, without having prepared a definitive edition of his own poems. And these were collected into what we call the Divan of Hafiz, comprising approximately 500 ghazals and a few poems in other forms only in the early 15th century, approximately a generation or so after his death. In the 15th century, the foundations of Hafiz's lasting fame were firmly laid, as he was gradually severed from the intertextual framework that I'm exploring tonight, that he had shared with his peers. Firstly, this was effected through the compilation of his divan, and then through its repeated copying and distribution, and then also through the divan's fetishization as an object in its own right, imbued with other worldly powers. By 1500, Hafiz's divan had become a kind of mass product, widely used for consulting omens and for popular storytelling. In 1343, around a decade after the effective collapse of Mongol rule in Iran, Shah Sheikh Abu Ishaq, the last Injuid ruler, gained control of Shiraz and ruled for a decade, marred by unsuccessful and costly campaigns aimed at wresting Yazd and Kerman from his key rivals, the Muzaffarids. By all accounts, Shah Sheikh Abu Ishaq's generous patronage saw the city flourish and restored Shiraz's reputation as a haven for poets, as it had been in the 13th century. Just as the Injuids, Muzaffarids, and the Jalayirids, the rulers of Baghdad and Tabriz, did battle by the sword so did their poets in pen, by critiquing, lampooning, and occasionally expressing admiration for one another. In this politically fractured landscape, the profusion of lively local patronage networks served to tip the balance in favour of poets, as numerous flourishing city-states with imperial aspirations vied to attract the best. Local kings, of course, needed eloquent poets to spread positive images of them abroad, which meant that considerable resources were made available to eulogists. The 14th century was a period of intense cultural exchange between the major cities of Iran and Iraq, and there was increased mobility among poets, with the cultural pull of Shiraz, Baghdad, and Tabriz being the strongest. From at least the early 13th century, poets praised Shiraz, its environs, and its inhabitants in verse. These standalone lyric poems in praise of what is known as the city of knowledge, the Darul Elm or Madineh Elm, can collectively be called Shiraziyat. Poets incorporated topophilia into their Shiraziyat, and the explicit use of a set repertoire of topographical allusions forged intertextual bridges linking poems from distinct historical periods, and that resulted over time in a harmonized vision of Shiraz as the ideal city par excellence. This poetic praise for Shiraz may at first seem hyperbolic, until we consider what travellers and geographers had to say about the city. In the 13th century, Shiraz is lauded for its healthy air, fresh water, and abundant agricultural products. And in the subsequent century, the famous North African traveller Ibn Battuta visited Shiraz twice during the lifetime of Hafiz. Ibn Battuta remarks how well built and superbly planned Shiraz is, how pious and chaste the city's inhabitants are, in particular the women, and he raised Shiraz second only to Damascus in the Islamic East in terms of markets and orchards. Shiraz is one of those cities whose charm inspires attachment, pride, and personal loyalty, and the lococentric poems produced in the city more than 6 or 7 centuries ago continue to dictate how Shiraz is memorialized and imagined today. In Hafiz's lifetime, prose texts were composed that promoted the idea of Shiraz as the promised paradise. In a work entitled the Shiraz Nameh, the city's blessed nature forms the focus. The author declares Shiraz the cream of all lands. It is the paradise garden reconfigured on earth. In court poetry, the royal audience hall is depicted itself as a micro-paradise, situated at the heart of the broader bliss that is Shiraz and its immediate hinterland. So these two poems here, side by side, the one on the left being Hafiz's most famous ghazal in praise of Shiraz, the one on the right being Sa'di from the previous century, Sa'di dying almost exactly a century before Hafiz died. So the one on the right being Sa'di's most famous poem for Shiraz, and I'm going to compare these poems to a certain extent. Hafiz's ghazal opens with a benediction for the city and a prayer for its good fortune, the kind of blessing one expects dedicated to the patron at the close of a panegyric qasidah. So this is the poem that opens Khosha Shiraz o vaz'a bi misalash, Khudavanda negah dar az zawalash. It's a very famous poem that everyone knows. In the opening line, Hafiz stresses Shiraz's uniqueness through the adjective bi-misal, peerless, but he uses to describe the city's goodly station, a feature, of course, of all great cities. Hafiz extends this prayer for the good fortune, this dua, into the second and the third lines, where he attaches the listener's attention to the Ruknabad Canal, the Jafarabad suburb, and the Mosalla flower meadow. Having introduced Shiraz's magnetism in the first 3 lines of his poem, Hafiz addresses those who reside elsewhere and entreats them to come to the city. As a poet with strong ties to the court, Hafiz worked to promote abroad a superior image of his patron and of his city. Line 4, in which the poet takes a somewhat pietistic stance, includes praise for Shiraz's inhabitants, who he describes as Sahib Kamal, that is, endowed with all human accomplishments and distinctions. In line 5, we encounter a subtle instance of self-boasting on behalf of the city. Shiraz is a greater source of sweetness, which is a standard metaphor in Persian for both physical beauty and literary eloquence, than Egypt itself, which was a major producer of sugar, and home to the captive and then triumphant Joseph, the epitome of ideal, youthful male beauty. Hafiz's prayer for Shiraz's good fortune, combined with his praise for the city's paradise-like allure, served to foreground a lament for an absent beloved, which underscores the link between the city and the human object of desire. It is as though Hafiz, by starting with praise and moving to erotic longing, has inverted the conventional order of the panegyric ode. As with almost all Persian lyric poetry, the love object longed for here is a young male, and the desire expressed is male homoerotic. By eulogizing a gypsy, a luli, Hafiz casts this absent beloved as a local rather than an exotic boy. This object of desire, he says, is a bloodthirsty, sweet boy, Shirin Pesar, an appellation that points to the patron as all-powerful beloved, the pivotal amorous topos of the panegyric ghazal. The connection between Hafiz's poem and Sa'di's, and the poem by Sa'di is the ode that opens Khusha sepide dami bashad an ke binam baz reside bar sar Allahu Akbar Shiraz. The connection between Hafiz's poem and Sa'di's is of course found in the very beginning, where both of them start Khusha, which you can translate as blessed be, or how fine is. Hafiz made it clear by opening his ghazal in the same way that Sa'di had done, that he intended it to be read against that of the master poet of Mongol Shiraz. This is a singular example of a dialogic device we find employed in the poetry of Shiraz, intertextual allusions to what you can call predecessor poems that reference a genre history or textual community that both poet and audience share. After the first initial words, though, similarities between Sa'di's poem and that of Hafiz become far more subtle. Unlike Hafiz, who speaks from within the city, Sa'di speaks at a distance from his hometown, and consequently his poem is tinged with a longing to return. The poet imagines viewing Shiraz from the vantage point of the Allahu Akbar gorge that overlooks the city from the north. What Sa'di sees is paradise on earth and a place of safety. In line 3, Sa'di too alludes to Khizr's quest in the darkness of the underworld, and an allusion to Shiraz as a former seat of Solomon's throne, Takhtgah Suleiman, speaks to the fact that from the early 13th century, Fars was referred to in poetry, prose, and official inscriptions as Mulk Suleiman, the realm of Solomon. From line 4, Sa'di adopts a pietistic tone, one that promotes Shiraz's moral economy. The poet sings of the city's 1,000 or more saints whose combined holiness gives strength to the Kaaba, Islam's most revered shrine. Perhaps borrowing from local history writing, Sa'di hints at the profound correlation between the physical city and the spiritual state of its denizens. Sa'di's statement here reflects the importance of Shiraz as a center for shrine visitation in this period. Of course, one of Shiraz's other epithets is Borja Awliya, or the Tower of Saints. Cities such as Shiraz derive devout power from the large-scale veneration of saintly bodies buried within them. The associated social, cultural, and of course commercial benefits of such large-scale shrine visitation cannot be ignored. Saadi continues to place emphasis on piety in line 5, where he invokes the memory and the associated holy blessing of two of the city's most celebrated mystics, with whom he perhaps felt a close personal connection. Poets and their patrons derive glory from the achievements of these individuals, and a pious gravitas attached to the physical location of their sacralizing remains in the city. Line 6 opens with a 2-line dua, in which Saadi calls on God via Abraham and the Kaaba to protect the city of righteous men from all oppressors. Saadi's wish that the people of his city continue to live in a state of splendor and pride, tajammul naz, is perhaps not so different from the tone of Hafiz's poem, since tajammul also means to beautify oneself or to live in luxury, and naz can mean the feigned disdain and the coquetry of the recalcitrant love object. Here you have 3 one-line quotations from the poetry of Hafiz, which are to do with specific and very important kind of nodes within the city. The Ab-e-Ruknabad, which we find referred to in many poems, is a subterranean canal that was built in the 10th century to carry fresh spring water for drinking and irrigation from the mountains 10 kilometers northeast of the city. Hafiz claims magical properties for Shiraz's water through allusions to the mysterious, mystical figure Khizr and his quest for the water of everlasting life. The Ab-e-Ruknabad is one of 3 loci repeatedly alluded to in Shiraziyat that evoke pleasure-seeking and poetry performance. The other 2 being the Mosalla meadow, which is the location where Hafiz's tomb is, and Ja'farabad, a small settlement famed for its cluster of suburban gardens and orchards, fed by man-made canals. To borrow terminology from Sneer and his study of Baghdad, Ruknabad, Mosalla, and Ja'farabad can be called Shiraz's 3 chief icons that serve to anchor the city's identity. Shirazis frequented all 3 in pursuit of earthly delights, and in the poetry, Ruknabad, Mosalla, and Ja'farabad combine to form an image of Shiraz as a place of total bliss. These locations fuel Shiraz's trans-regional pull and excite passionate attachment in locals and outsiders alike, and we shall see that in a moment. The fixed association of these toponyms and their repeated and significant use across multiple poems functions in a not dissimilar way to a word I will now mispronounce from Japanese, which is utamakura. Utamakura, or place names, act, Kamens tells us, as nodes within a poem through which the maker of that poem reaches out to make contact with other poems or poetic moments, and thereby complicate or enrich the signifying process of that poem as a whole. In my assessment, Ruknabad, Mosalla, and Ja'farabad are akin to Meisho Utamakura, places that are famous precisely, though not exclusively, because of their roles in poetry. There is little evidence that Hafiz spent any time away from Shiraz, and the poet uses an allusion to the pull of Shiraz's emotive loci to excuse his inertia, and you see that here. Hafiz was evidently trapped in a kind of amorous entanglement with his hometown. But as we shall see, this relationship with the city expressed in this fashion, in these poems which celebrate Shiraz, is not unique to Hafiz. The first line, just to explain I purposefully didn't put the names of the poets so that you focus more on the lines themselves and on the fact that there is comparability across these poems. The first extract there is from Obaid Zarqani, who I will talk about now. The second from another contemporary poet, Emad Kermani, who really made his career primarily in Shiraz. And the third is from a very less known poet, Haydar Shirazi, who was a slightly more junior colleague of both Hafiz and Emad. Obaid Zarqani, who died in 1371, was, as most of us know, really a very famous and important satirist of medieval Iran. But he was also someone who produced a large amount of what one might call more serious courtly poetry. Although he wasn't native to Shiraz, he made his literary career primarily in the city. In pre-modern times, of course, patriotism was a local sentiment, love of terra patria. But Obaid was a migrant poet, and he alludes many times in his poems to the idea that he is in a temporary sojourn in Fars, and speaks of himself as an outsider. Very often he calls himself Gharib, kind of a stranger who is out of place and far from his hometown. But for Obaid, Mosala and Ruknabad more than compensate for his alien status. So in that first quotation there, the second part of it, Gharib ra vatan khish mi barad az yad, the two words Gharib and Vatan are very loaded, as they still are in Persian today. In many ways, I think we can speak of Obaid as a kind of restless alien. You see that in his poems repeatedly, and very much so in this quotation here. Whereas again, he talks about himself as being both at the end there, Darvishi o Qaribi o Zahmat Zahad Gozasht. That he, by Darvishi, he presumably means poverty rather than anything else. But his Qaribi, his being in a state of being out of place, being a stranger, being a foreigner in Shiraz, at least expressed in this poem, is a very negative experience for him. Obaid left Shiraz around 1353 in the wake of the overthrow and flight to Esfahan of his patron Shah Sheikh Abu Ishaq, who I mentioned earlier. The poet eventually found his way to Baghdad, and most likely, with the help of his newly found friend Salman Saveji, who was chief panegyrist to the Jalayirids, gained access to the glittering circle of Sultan Owais, the ruler of Baghdad. Near the end of his life, Obaid successfully solicited Muzaffarid patronage, which we'll talk about in a moment. Here are two poems by Obaid, two ghazals side by side. The one on the left is a ghazal in which he laments and very much bemoans the fact that he has to leave Shiraz, and he leaves Shiraz under duress, not willingly, with his life in danger. It's a very powerful, rather poignant, touching, moving poem, and not the kind of poem that we associate with what we at least think about Obaid Zarqani. So I encourage you, if you read Persian, to go back to Obaid Zarqani, to get the edition of Mahjub, and to read his serious poetry. The poem on the right is a poem that is an expression of a desire, both a commitment to Shiraz, but a desire to return to the city. What is extremely interesting about the poem on the right is the way in which it imitates the poem of Sa'di that I mentioned earlier. It has the same meter, it has the same rhyme scheme, which is based around the name of the city itself. It begins, مرا دلیست گرفتار خطه شیراز ز من بریده و خو کرده با تنعم و ناز. and continues using many of the rhyme words that we find in the poem of Sa'di, but also phrases, and I'll come to one of those in a moment. As I said, Ubayd returned to Shiraz in the last years of his life, midway through the reign of Hafiz's most celebrated patron, Shah Shuja. Ubayd's extant qasidas in praise of Shah Shuja bear witness to the poet's tenacity in recultivating royal favour in Shiraz after a considerable period of absence, much of which was spent in the rival Jalayirid Baghdad. When Ubayd fled in 1353, the thought or the reality of leaving Shiraz, as we see in the poem on the left, is far too much for him to bear. And in this heartfelt ghazal, he depicts his involuntary departure from the city, alluding to the fear that separation from Shiraz will spell his professional downfall. In this poem, Ubayd appears to be in competition in some ways with Sa'di, spurred on by a desire not only to imitate but also outdo him. As with all great response poems, though, Ubayd invokes enough of the earlier poem to garner attention for his own, and whilst penning a masterful challenge to it. Ubayd's celebration of his adoptive town is, of course, characteristically counter-pietistic, but like Sa'di, he also speaks at a distance from Shiraz. So in the poem on the right, in the first line, there is this obvious and possibly satirical imitation of Sa'di's phrase, tajammul naz, where Ubayd speaks of his heart becoming accustomed to tana'um wa naz, ease and coquetry. In line 2, Ubayd's counterpietistic view of the city comes into full view. Shiraz offers and is emblematic of the good life in all its erotic splendour. Contrary to Sa'di's pious whitewashing of the city, Ubayd presents us with a balance. His heart associates with the magi in the wine taverns, as well as with the Sufis and their lodge. Ultimately, though, the poet promotes an antinomian perspective that finds its crescendo in line 5. Whereas Sa'di depicts the Kaaba taking flight above the hallowed tombs of Shiraz's innumerable saints, his 14th century imitator depicts the poet's intoxicated heart flying from above the head of the wine bibber. In lines 6 and 7, we find homoerotic imagery not dissimilar to Hafiz's. In the ghazals of Shiraz, the eroto-panegyric is seldom absent. What is fascinating, and you can see in the final portion of that poem on the right by Ubayd, is that this is a poem written most likely in Baghdad, dedicated to the ruler of Baghdad, and asking the ruler of Baghdad to facilitate his return to Shiraz. It tells you, this one short poem that is overlooked by most people who, not only people who study Ubayd, but also, of course, people who study Hafiz, is a window really onto the relationship between these courts at the time. Because they're competing with one another, but they're also, of course, working in a way alongside one another. There is a lot of interaction. Here the interaction is literary, it's to do with poetry, and how poetry connects to the court and the centre of power. But these dynasties were also intermarried. And they perhaps at one point did battle, but they also made alliances against other local dynasties, the typical, kind of Game of Thrones type, which is an American illusion for all of you Americans. It's also something Persian in Game of Thrones, isn't it? Music is very important.
All comes from that.
Of course, yes, most things. I want to now turn to talk a bit more about the relationship between Shiraz and Baghdad that we find in this poetry. If you look at the beginning there, that is a two-line quotation from a poem not by a poet who made his career in Shiraz, but by Salman Saveji, who was a Persian poet who migrated to Baghdad. Baghdad at the time, in the 14th century, is a center for Persian poetry, primarily, not for Arabic poetry, because of the ruling dynasty and their attachment to Persian as their court and their literary language of choice. But you can see again, you have this desire for and this attachment to Ruknabad, and how that draws one towards Shiraz. Of course, what potentially Salman is saying here is that he is flirting with the idea of a relationship with the court of Shiraz. He may even simply be responding to the many allusions in the poetry of his key rival, Hafiz, in which Hafiz plays with the idea and in a way flirts with the court of Baghdad, saying that perhaps it's now time that he move on from Shiraz, or that he's not respected enough in his own city, that he might have a better deal in Baghdad. He never went to Baghdad, but he talks about it a lot. Maybe Salman is kind of reciprocating in this short ghazal. The other two quotations are from another poet, one of these very less well-known poets that I've looked at in order to try and gain some insight into what is actually happening between these rival courts. You can see this poet is called Attar Shirazi, or Ruha Attar, the spirit of Attar in a way. But he wrote, unlike what Attar, the famous Attar, focused on, which really was more Masnavi than anything else, although he has important ghazals. Ruha Attar was a minor court poet, but someone who was close enough both to the court in terms of power, but also to important literary circles. That middle quotation just shows the way in which a poet like Attar plays with the relationship between Baghdad and Shiraz. Here he talks about the Tigris having the potential to flow through Shiraz rather than Baghdad if you were to weep. That's a rather romantic image. The third line, the third extract, is also from Ruha Attar. But here, what he's doing is comparing, and he does this in more than one poem, is comparing Salman with Hafiz, or Hafiz with Salman. And he says in this poem elsewhere, where this quotation comes from, that he was asked in Shiraz by people of his circle, which was the greater poet? Was it Hafiz or was it Salman? And given that Attar, this Attar is a poet from Shiraz, is being asked by a group of people in Shiraz, who are very close to the court of Shiraz, which is meant to be a sworn enemy in many ways of the court of Baghdad, and Salman is the most important court poet in Baghdad, he gives this very balanced, very diplomatic, very respectful, in relation to Salman, a very respectful assessment of the comparative and the really equal station of these poets. It's fascinating because of the context within which Attar says these things. But it also challenges then the way in which we, looking back to the 14th century and to this particular context of Shiraz and how it related to other cities at the time, it challenges the way in which we must go back and read Hafiz again. Because if people at the time are able to say this, then we need to, I believe, strip away some of that kind of habit that has developed over a very long period of time since the end of the 15th century, of seeing Hafiz and Hafiz's place within Shiraz as something that is completely separate from other poets at the time. This is not how they worked. They worked in an environment in which they were competing, but also, as Attar shows you here, in which they were responding sometimes quite respectfully to one another, and not always in a kind of tug of war. A poet who I think was probably much less respectful than Salman is the wonderful Kamal Khojandi. If you want another kind of good laugh, you should read Kamal Khojandi. He's not as rude as Obaid, but he is he's very interesting in terms of how confident he is in his own brilliance and how he sees himself both in relation to the past and in relation to contemporaries. As I've said, the poets active in Shiraz and in rival cultural hubs across the 14th century, throughout the 14th century and across Iran and Iraq, worked within localized yet interconnected networks of composition, performance, reception, and transmission. Poets continually played off one another, all the while treading this fine line between plagiarism, imitation, and mimicry. They strove to not only outdo one another in eloquence, but also to negotiate a foothold for themselves in the tradition by asserting their status as rightful heirs to the poetic past. And this is something that Kamal does repeatedly in relation to Sa'di. It was through imitation of both dead and living poets and mastering the canon and its generic conventions that the successful poet made a lasting name for him or herself. In Persian, poetic imitation, which can be formal, lexical, syntactic, or semantic, or all at the same time, as explored by Lozensky in his work on Safavid poetry, is known by various names, including istiqbal, which means welcoming, tatabbu, pursuit, iqtifa, following, jawab gu'i, answering, but also in a sense dialoguing, or nazir gu'i, which is composing parallel or companion poems after and in response to an earlier poem. Poetic response, which normally involved the adoption of the formal features of the model poem and often featured a direct quotation of a line or a key phrase from it, and we've seen many examples of that, was not considered plagiarism but rather borrowing. When a poet engages in istiqbal, a demand is made that the new poem be read in dialogue with its source. But the towering genius of a canonical poet, such as Sa'di, could, if not negotiated wisely, stifle the talent of an aspiring one, which meant that imitation could only be embarked upon with a deep knowledge of literary heritage. As Lewis has reminded us, imitation was permissible, even desirable, as long as the responding poet proved a worthy imitator. In imitation, intertextual acknowledgement of poetic prowess is coupled with an implicit challenge to the poet whose words are being reworked. The imitator presents him or herself as an equal, equipped with the necessary literary skills, not only to imitate, but also to interpret and potentially better the work of his predecessor or contemporary. Such social intercourse assumes that the poet and the consumer belong to a single textual community. The practice of responding to predecessors and contemporaries via jawab gu'i also has a diachronic value, in that it has the potential to create a trans-historical chain of intertextual replies. Abundant evidence of the literary and broader cultural superiority of Shiraz is found in the works of poets who did not make their careers in Shiraz, such as, in this case, Kamal Khojandi, who died around 1400. When Kamal invokes the memory of Sa'di, Shiraz's most famous dead poet, his tone is often haughty. In a ghazal written in imitation of one by Sa'di, which ends with a half-line quoted verbatim from the model poem, Kamal declares his response to that poem to be no less eloquent than Sa'di's original poem. Kamal boasts that if Sa'di had been alive in his day, he would have wiped clean his poetry notebook upon hearing Kamal's subtle sayings. Elsewhere, Kamal suggests that his poetic genius is fed by Sa'di's. He talks about his fragrant plot, his bustan, and of course there's an allusion to Sa'di's monumental poem. Kamal claims that he has mastered Sa'di's delicate poetic skill, such that no one believes that he is from Khojand originally, which is in Central Asia, and not from Shiraz itself. Kamal is the self-designated Sa'di of the age, by virtue of his fine poetry and his prose. Kamal quotes directly from Sa'di and claims that his own verses are so sweet that they will not only attract sugar from Egypt, but also Sa'di himself from Shiraz, as though he would come out of the grave in order to pay homage to Kamal. The Tabriz-based poet says that because of him, Khojand, which was previously considered inferior to Shiraz, has now gained a degree of honor. Kamal's poetry also bears the mark of interaction with that of his most famous and most celebrated Shirazi contemporary, Hafiz. In one ghazal, Kamal reassures his Tabrizi audience. So, what I'm talking about now is this last quotation, which is a response to the line above, which is by Hafiz. In that ghazal, Kamal reassures his Tabrizi audience that for their sake, he will not express a desire to travel to Shiraz and will not, therefore, seek the patronage of the Muzaffarids. It's difficult to know the exact extent to which Hafiz's poetry had spread during his lifetime, but it is reasonable to assume that it was not only known to the Jalairids, but also performed at the courtly wine and poetry parties staged in both Baghdad and Tabriz. Hafiz's ghazals would have spread to these Persian-speaking courts along the same routes taken by itinerant Sufis, pilgrims, preachers, merchants, musicians, and entertainers, and of course poets, who passed through Shiraz, having intersected the elite and non-elite networks in which Hafiz's ghazals circulated. Whatever the medium, whether it be war, trade, diplomacy, wandering sages, travelling musicians, itinerant poets, Hafiz's poetry exported his fame and that of his patrons far beyond Shiraz, without him having to leave the city for any significant amount of time. In 1421, Muhammad Gul-Andam says that Hafiz's poetry, and I think he means during his lifetime, had spread to Turkestan, by which he means the part of Central Asia closest to Afghanistan and modern-day Iran, Hindustan, India, Iraqain, both of the Iraqs, meaning the Iranian plateau essentially, and Arab Iraq, and Azerbaijan. As I've already mentioned, Hafiz's popularity was consolidated in the Timurid period with the compilation, voracious copying, and wide dissemination of his divan. Timurid fascination with Hafiz is manifest in the humorous javabs, or responses, to over 20 of Hafiz's ghazals and the ghazals of many other 13th and 14th century poets by a poet who's known as Bushaq Shirazi, or At-Emeh, foods, but also in the poetry of Jami, the great poet, and in a traditional way of thinking, the last really truly great classical poet of Persian poetry, who died near the end of the 15th century. Jami in his ghazals quotes repeatedly, or imitates repeatedly, Hafiz and Sa'di in a very deliberate fashion. Jami's poetry was popular across the full span of what people now refer to as the Persianate world, meaning from really Anatolia all the way into Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent by the close of the 15th century. Given his deep intertextual dialogue with Hafiz, perhaps Jami should be credited with solidifying Hafiz's posthumous popularity. The power of imitation and invocation for the dissemination of a poet's works must not be underestimated. Manuscripts produced in the last few decades of the 14th century and the first few decades of the 15th show that Hafiz's ghazals were read side by side with those of his contemporaries. And here you have a list of really the most important poets of Shiraz, Tabriz, Baghdad, and smaller places such as Yazd and Kerman. In a manuscript produced in 1407, Ghazals by Hafiz are inscribed in the margins, with Salman's poetry as the central text. A manuscript from 1421, this most important one, early one, contains 428 ghazals by Hafiz, the preface by Golandam, as well as Jalal, one of these other poets who is mentioned here. Jalaluddin Azad Yazdi, who made his career again really ultimately in Shiraz, as well as Jalal's whole divan and a selection of the short lyric poems of Kamal Khojandi. I've already mentioned the case of Bushaq Shirazi, who died in the 1420s, who was a younger contemporary of Hafiz and whose poetry displays, interestingly, a complete disregard for mystical pretensions. And his parodies of more than 20 of Hafiz's ghazals and many ghazals by other poets really are very worthwhile for those working on Hafiz to study, because they show which of Hafiz's poems really were the most popular at the turn of the end of the 14th, going into the 15th century in Shiraz. By the close of the 14th century, Shiraz itself had become synonymous in the collective Persian imaginary with fine poetry and innate poetic genius. All the great poets of the immediate post-Mongol period either hailed from the city, spent part or the entirety of their career there, or connected their poetry intertextually with that of preeminent Shirazi poets. In such lyrical encounters within a trans-regional network of dense intertextual relationships that included poets in Shiraz, Yazd, Kerman, Isfahan, Baghdad, and Tabriz, living poets attempted to forge a link with Sa'di's canonical lyric legacy and thereby appropriate a portion of Sa'di's fame, whilst promoting the idea that they and no one else, was the true heir and the true inheritor of his inimitably simple style. Ghazals are texts that travel easily between multiple performance contexts, both within and across sites of production. In the case of poets such as Sa'di and Hafiz, as I've said, their ghazals travel to rival courts dotted across large swathes of the Persianate world. Following the death of Hafiz, Shiraz underwent a further transformation into a kind of poetical image for later Persian poets. And this was particularly the case for those poets active in India, who considered Shiraz as, quote, and this is Anne-Marie Schimmel, the true home of classical Persian lyrics, the ideal city of the purest literary tradition. As Schimmel has argued, to state that one's heritage was Shirazi was to claim spiritual and linguistic nobility. As Hafiz himself seems to have predicted, Shekar shekan shavand pame tutiyan Hind, zin qand Parsi ke be Bangale mi ravad. They will crack sugar, all the the poets of India, from this Persian candy that travels to Bengal. Thank you very much. I welcome your questions and even your comments. Please.
What means by which these manuscripts were transmitted? Were professional scripts and schools that specialize in these, or there kind of public libraries that made it available?
Public libraries is a little bit of a stretch of the imagination, I think. I mean, we know that there were very important collections of copies of the Quran and of certain religious texts in Shiraz at the time. In the what is now called Masjid Atiq, the most, the oldest, or thought to be the oldest mosque in Shiraz that is still standing, but also in the collection around the shrine of Shah Cheragh, the most important Shi'i shrine that is in the center of Shiraz. So we know that in the in the 13th century, but in relation to this period, in the earlier part of the 14th century, a lot of money was put by the local rulers, in particular the mother of Shah Sheikh Abu Ishaq, into producing very fine copies of the Quran. So they had a kind of more public, I guess, presence, although you couldn't really still call it public. In terms of poetry, I mean, these poems of this type, in ghazal form, they're very short poems, and they're very easy, really, and especially at that time, given that the people who were performing them were professional performers, professional musicians or singers. They're very easy to memorize. So you don't, at least initially, necessarily need them to be written down or copied in large numbers for them to be disseminated. That's of course important when things do start to become collected into singular, collected volumes, divan of an individual poet. But as I mentioned, some of those manuscripts, and there are many others, from one or two which are actually from the lifetime of Hafiz himself as well. They are very often in the form and in the original form of a kind of majmu'ah. So they might have a full divan of a particular poet in the same manuscript as then a selection of 50, 60, 70 poems by another poet, and then a handful by someone else, etc., etc. But quite often they are originally created in that way. And if you have a majmu'ah like that, you have a library. But of course it is a contemporary library. It's it's the bestsellers of that particular period. Please.
I was wondering the source of the last quotation you offered regarding translation of poetry from Shiraz to
It's from a ghazal by Hafiz, one of his famous ghazals. And, a lot is written about Hafiz and about that poem as well. And a lot of people disagree what the actual historical context of it is. But it seems to allude to him having been invited, perhaps in a rather formal way, to one of the local courts of India, of Bengal. What I think is more interesting about it is, and you find this quite often in a good number of Hafiz's poems, that he has a sense that his poetry is spreading quite far and wide, or at least it has the ability to do that. That kind of line that I ended with is perhaps within Hafiz's lifetime is something that is aspirational. But very quickly after his death, and perhaps before he had died, it became a reality. There is if you read Persian, there is a very interesting article by Shafi'i Kadkani about how a single poem might be transmitted. And he has a theory on how quickly a ghazal from somewhere like Shiraz could end up in Tabriz or Baghdad or even as far as India, Central Asia. And that even to those what must have seemed quite remote places in relation to Shiraz, I think Shafi'i Kadkani thinks that an individual poem could travel there within a month, within a couple of months. I mean, we're not talking about years necessarily for poems to spread that far at that time. Please.
What do you think about Khosrow Dehlami? Was a little bit before.
He's a contemporary of Saadi.
Yes, at that time, but he was very renowned by Hafiz because the book of Hasht Behesh, that's one of the books Hafiz has written all with his hand at the time that he was in Yad. And Then he is referring to Tuti, Shekar Shekar Shaban, have a Tuti hen. Tuti was the abbreviation name for Amir Khosrow the Dabi. So he was very interested by Hafiz. I think when you are going to tell all of them, must talk also about that. Because
yeah, these are the people who are active at the time of Hafiz,
yeah, but
which is not Amir Khosrow. He's been dead for
because he
a
was
century.
a little bit far, he was in India.
I mean, he's also dead. Yes, Sadi never dies, but Amir Khosrow is definitely dead at this point.
Go to India,
Yes.
he never died.
I'm joking. I'm kind of English as well as Persian. I'm joking. Yeah, but yes, it's true. I mean, you see the problem and the beauty of Persian poetry, medieval or pre-modern Persian poetry, is that unlike, let's just say, English, medieval English, there are hundreds of important poets, right? And the way in which the tradition worked up until, really the beginning of the 20th century, and in some cases long into the 20th century, is that a great poet draws from, all of these great figures that come before him or her. And someone like Hafiz, and to their credit, some Iranian scholars now in Persian are writing in this way. It's very difficult to argue for originality in Hafiz once you start to look very closely at where, not just imagery and metaphor, but quite concrete things like whole phrases, if not half lines. The way in which he uses rhyme, the way in which he uses meter, the way in which he uses the radif in Persian, the repeated word or phrase at the end. Very little of it is original in any way that we would understand it. And that's not to say that, not to diminish his achievement, but rather to help us understand that a poet who almost dies in 1400, when he picks up his pen, or rather, composes poetry without writing, which is probably what he was doing, he is referencing people all the way back to Rudaki and behind Rudaki, right? It is that kind of tradition. And it's very difficult, I think, for us to understand that relationship. Amir Khosrow, yes, is important. I mean, there is a very interesting example where Jahan Malik Khatun, who is a poet I've worked on a lot, is the only female poet that I've mentioned here, a direct contemporary of Hafiz, someone who you can see from her poetry was responding to or being responded to by Hafiz. They seem definitely to have been in dialogue, whether or not they knew each other personally, but they certainly dialogue in their written work. Jahan Malik Khatun has a qasideh in praise of Shah Shuja that uses almost a full ghazal by Amir Khosrow in the poem without saying this has anything to do with Amir Khosrow. So I mean, that is a very deliberate behavior by a poet. I think much more deliberate than what you can find in Hafiz. It's a little bit more subtle, but that's a very deliberate borrowing from Amir Khosrow in order to praise a contemporary patron.
He had borrowed also the first line and the first in the beginning of the Hafiz Divan. He says, "Ela ya ayyuhas saqi."
Sure.
That's "Ela ya ayyuhas saqi adal ka'san wa nawwalha." Exactly in Nasr Khosrow. In Amir Khosrow.
Sure, but I mean it's a far older Arabic poem.
So, yeah, I know, but most of them they are used.
Sure.
But Hafiz comes after.
Yes. Yes, I guess so. Yeah. Sorry, gentleman there, and then the one behind you.
To solve the problem in terms of Shiraz specifically, you mentioned that Sadi was about 100 years before.
Yes.
This. So, where would you say was the origin of poetry in Shiraz? How did that get altered?
Why does it become, the thing that is...
Who did it start with, or how did it look like?
I guess the thing that is easier to answer is why you could have someone like Sa'di in Shiraz in the 13th century. And, the fact is that, there's been a lot of, historians now who do a lot of kind of revision of the way in which the Mongol period, not only the Mongol period, but the Mongol invasion is talked about. And it's important to remember that there was a lot of destruction with the coming of the Mongols. But in quite a few places, and one of them is Shiraz, there was very little destruction. Because the city negotiated, because the city learned and was, capable of not getting along with, but, not putting up enough of a fight that meant that they would be destroyed. And so Shiraz in the middle of the 13th century, which is really the most important period for Sa'di and for the formation of Sa'di, is one of those few places that has a long history, that has not been particularly attacked by the Mongols. And the Mongols allow the Salghurid dynasty of Shiraz to continue to effectively rule Fars. Right? There's a long line of, and they call themselves king. They call themselves king of Iran at some point. They are the ones that repeatedly use this idea of Mulk Suleiman, the dominion or the realm of Solomon. They have a very elevated view of themselves, but they're allowed to cultivate that and continue that, even though we have the coming of the Mongols and then, the Ilkhanid period, the period of Mongol rule in Iran. So that is why you can have someone like Sa'di in the 13th century. The origin of New Persian poetry, as we call it, the poetry that emerges and the literary form that emerges after the coming of Islam to the Iranian world, the origin of that primarily is Eastern Iranian. It is the broader region of Khorasan, so modern-day Eastern Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, going into what is Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, that whole area, that is where New Persian poetry comes from. It doesn't come from Shiraz. Something that's very interesting about this, and why I kind of ended in talking about Indian poets that are later than this, rather than Amir Khosrow, people who are, very much are Indian rather than anything else, is that even though New Persian poetry doesn't originate from Shiraz, they do such a good job in the 13th and 14th century, you would think it did. Just like the language itself. The New Persian emerges in Khorasan originally. It doesn't emerge in Fars, but we call it Farsi. But it doesn't emerge in Fars, really. Yeah? The Dari, that is still the word used in Afghanistan, is the word that is primarily used in Khorasan in the, we're talking about the 8th, the 9th, going into the 10th century. That is where all of that literary work is happening. That's why you have Rudaki from Samarkand. That's why you have his contemporary, Shahid Balkhi. If you look at all of the important poets of the late 9th and the 10th century, they are all Samarkandi, Marvi, Balkhi, Termezi, Bukhari. Yeah? They're not from anywhere else. Even with the Ghaznavids, they are, Farrokhi is from Sistan originally, right? Eastern Iran. Manuchehri is from Damghan, but it's still not, it's not Fars. It's not Esfahan. It's not, there is later a shift, but it's not where it originates from. So the fact that everyone still goes on and on and on about how Shiraz is really, the home of poetry, of lyric poetry, is a testament to what Sa'di did, and then the kind of canonization of Sa'di through imitation that you find in Hafiz, but also all of these other poets of the time. Sorry. No, sorry, it's the, yes, with the glasses, and then it's you.
Obviously, there is a lot of influence of Islam on
Yes.
poetry. But then there is a lot of reference to wine and drunkenness, which refers to the spirituality and going beyond the religious aspect of it. Can you talk to that?
In regards to what?
Is there really, what's the reference to wine? What's the reference to
Sure.
drunkenness? And is that the higher aspect of religion, or is it just literal translation?
Yeah, I mean the point really of the ghazal form, especially in Persian, as it develops, is and the height of this aspect that I'm going to talk about is the poetry of Hafiz himself, is an ambiguity between whether something is meant to be primarily mystical or not, right? That's the whole point of, that's the crux of what he does with the ghazal. And so even when we ask the question, is it more this or is it more that? I mean, we miss the point of what he's doing, because he does it in a way that allows for a multiplicity of ways of understanding, ways of using a poem. Yeah, these poems didn't have a singular or a just a one-time performance or recitation. They had many, and they had many immediately, in different contexts for different purposes. So with a poet like Hafiz, I think it's futile most of the time to try and pull one apart from another. So yeah, I would say when he talks about drunkenness, he means both. But both are not necessarily to be thought of as two poles, but rather something that works together. And we like to see things in as a dichotomy. You know, we like to see things in black and white, but actually, you know, the relationship in Hafiz is far more complicated. I can't remember whether it's Shamisa or Ma'ayad. And they both talk about this in a slightly different way. But when trying to explain the relationship between what you can call profane or earthly and non-mystical and mystical in the ghazal, I think one of them says that it's as though the Persian ghazal has a kind of a backbone or a column to it which is non-mystical, and that mystical elements kind of attach to that as you go up the poem or down the poem. That these things are fused together, but in a way that is often in Hafiz impossible to think about how to separate. But the question really goes back to what is happening in the 9th century and the 10th century and the 11th century. And in those centuries, in lyric poetry, so in poetry that is meant to be talking or presents itself as though talking about personal experience and about love normally and loss in love and things like that, that is very often also the poetry that can be sung and performed and accompanied with music. In Persian, in those periods, it has almost zero mystical content. But it has huge amount to say about wine, right? Wine was obviously very important, as it had been, but very important to those early Muslim courts in the Iranian context. And so when you get the development of mystical lyric poetry, which becomes very important by the middle or latter part of the 11th century going onwards, and of course is very well established by the time you have Sa'di and Hafiz, you are looking at something that even with Rumi, you know, who is undoubtedly a mystical poet, a Sufi, an important Sufi, he is writing ghazal, which is very often appears to be about the human erotic experience or about drunkenness in a very kind of, you know, worldly fashion. But he means to use those things for a mystical effect. But if you either as the poet or the audience or now us later as readers, if we don't have an appreciation for the origin and the kind of groundwork that is the basis for the mystical use of those metaphors, the metaphor in its mystical sense kind of collapses. If you don't have an appreciation for drunkenness or the erotic on a human level, then using it as a mystical metaphor doesn't mean anything, right? It can mean something, I guess, if you repeatedly think about and study the idea of a mystical experience that is akin to a strong emotion. But it's pretty difficult to grasp that without having an appreciation for the other thing. I think it's the same when you look at this poetry. If you don't know where it comes from and what it is reworking or building upon, then you remain kind of confounded by the fact that there's so much wine imagery. But actually it's not really the case.
May I inject sort of here when this is my turn? This is my turn.
You wanted to inject something? Yes.
You will forgive my language and you will forgive my...
You have to speak loudly, I think.
Loudly. The question is this: 4th century Iranian, from the researchers, the poets, they involved a very endless and fruitless argument about that is, Hafiz is drinking wine or not. When he talks about love, it is the love, it is the earthly love, or heavenly love. The wine that he talked about it is coming from Pakistan Azrin, or from Shiraz, or from heaven. This discussion that is unfortunately continued for centuries. It is endless, fruitless, and I believe one day because we don't pay attention to what Hafiz said, what his poetry, the spirit of his poetry, and the importance of his personality and what he said, and the beauty of his poetry, instead of to be involved in that he is drinking or not drinking. And this wine is a spiritual wine or no. I don't know if you listen to the Mozart or Beethoven, you think that Beethoven died because he drank too much. Or when you look to the very beautiful sculpture about Rodin or something, and you believe,
Sorry, sir, we only have a few minutes left.
Is he
Can you ask
Catholic
a question?
or so on? Yes?
Can you ask a question? We just have a few minutes left with the professor.
I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Please.
Thank you for your talk. Just out of curiosity, back at that time, how was these poems used in the society? Was it used for education or life coach or entertainment?
All, I would think. It depends on, as I tried to explain, I think and it's a difficult thing for us to do, but each one of these ghazals may have had an original purpose, being composed for an original purpose, but very quickly could be used for a whole number of things. So entertainment of various types, yes, as a kind of song, but also, they not all of them, but many of them have a kind of deeper weight to them, so can be used for different kinds of contemplation. So, yeah. I mean, they don't have any one particular use.
So, as everybody knows, Hafiz and his poems have a very special place in the Iranian literature and for people as Father Hafiz and lots of traditions.
Sure.
How come Hafiz historically to this position?
Again, I think I explained that that phenomenon is really a creation, most likely, of the Timurid period, of the 15th century. Whether or not, there was definitely, not definitely, there was possibly a sense that there was something a little bit more special about Hafiz, right? During his lifetime, around the time he died. But this idea that the divan can be used in that way, given that the divan, as far as anyone knows, was not compiled during his lifetime, then obviously has no relationship to him. The use of the divan cannot have a relationship to Hafiz personally, because it did not exist when he was alive, as far as anyone knows. But you know, the 15th century is a long time ago. As the gentleman was saying, people, you know, have for hundreds of years have been having the debate about the real wine and not the real wine and the mystical wine. But they've been having the debate about, you know, is Hafiz more important than all of his friends and enemies for as long, yeah, for 500 years. It's a long time, 600 years. It's a very long time. So it's almost impossible for people who study Persian literature and for, you know, people who interact with these things on a maybe slightly less academic or not necessarily less informed but less academic way. It's impossible really to leave that to one side and to then try and look at Hafiz in a way that doesn't involve all of these preconceived notions of his position. But that requires reading, you know, 20 or 30 other poets that are writing at the same time and trying to think about how they interact with one another. Please.
I was wondering, I noticed some references to boys, and was the love of boys like in ancient Greece? Or, I mean, was a lot of the love poetry directed at males?
Most likely, yes.
More than females, would you say?
This kind of poetry, yes. But Persian poetry has many important forms, and the form, the Masnavi form, which is used for storytelling, is generally the form that is used for telling romances. And in romance in Persian poetry, 95% of the time it's male-female, it's heteroerotic. But lyric poetry is generally homoerotic, it's true. But it's in part because it, you know, that, or rather that is exacerbated by the fact that a lot of it is panegyric, and almost without exception the rulers were male. Sometimes they are female, and then there has to be a renegotiation in the lyric poetry to accommodate that. So it makes sense to praise a male because, to eroticize a male because you're praising a male patron. And then when it's used for mystical purposes, God is generally conceived of as being male as well. And of course the prophet is also male. So these things work quite well together in that way. One, two, I think we have 4 more questions and then... Please. بله بفرمایید.
برای که من خودم شیرازی هستم و اهل شیرازم، معلم تاریخ بودم، سوالی از حضور شما ندارم. از راه دوری با همه گرفتاری‌ها اومدم با این برنامه شما آشنا بشم. تنها سوالی نیست، فقط می‌خواستم واقعا دستبوس شما باشم با این برنامه بسیار قشنگی که توضیح دادین در مورد شهر من، هرچند که شهر هممون هم از ما ایرانی هستیم.
محبت داریم.
خواستم سپاسگزار کنم. واقعا این اولین و بهترین اطلاعاتی بود که در طول 73 سال عمر من که 50 سالشم معلم بودم نشد. تنها خواستم بگم سپاسگزارم هستم. این برنامه خوب شما که واقعا من مرده بودم زنده شدم.
محبت داریم. Oh, sorry. The lady was saying that she herself is from Shiraz, and I won't translate it in the way that she said it, but she was very, very grateful for the way in which I presented the poetry, but also the history of her hometown.
I'll translate it. She said she's from Shiraz. This is the best description of her city she has ever heard in 73 years. She was a teacher and taught history, and she is extremely grateful that she has been revived by this remarkable presentation.
Please.
I'm very, very unknowledgeable about Iranian history, but how did this get through the Islamic culture that into Iran?
Well, I think the problem is that, so I have two answers. One is, and again, many people in this room will know better than me, but Hafiz talks quite often in his poems about the figure of the muhtasib. Now, the muhtasib is really an administrative position. It is someone who, originally at least, went into the marketplace to make sure that people weren't cheating and that their weights and measures were correct, right? But that position develops, and certainly develops in the poetry of Hafiz, into a very kind of vilified figure that polices the morality of the urban space. Yeah? He is an enemy, Hafiz is an enemy of this figure. But the muhtasib, very often in his poetry, is a way for Hafiz to talk about the first Muzaffarid king who ruled Shiraz, who is generally thought of as someone who was not interested in poetry. I mean, we have quite a lot of poetry written for him, so that's not necessarily true. But he's very famous for apparently being very, very pious, and as Hafiz tells us, and other poets do, of closing down the wine taverns and controlling public space in relation to what he saw as immoral behavior. So one way of answering your question is to say, in the period of someone like Mubarizzuddin, who is the muhtasib, it didn't do very well, this kind of poetry. But he was an exception for the period we're talking about. I think our way of thinking about not necessarily the religion, but the kind of Islamic culture, as if there is such a thing, is today very narrow. And it's understandable why it's so narrow, but it's extremely narrow and doesn't help when we try and think about this medieval context. Just as, if someone, on the kind of flip side, if someone says that, you can't call Hafiz a mystic because he is he's really a secular poet. He stands outside of religion. He's not part of religion. And, I mean, these ways of talking about a medieval context are essentially nonsense. But they're nonsense, because nobody stood outside of religion in that sense, right? Because that was the fundament of culture. But religion was a far broader thing than we think of it today. Yeah? There were many ways of being, I don't think any of these individuals saw themselves as not being Muslim, but they had a different way of interacting with certain things than, maybe.
But that's true in Europe too, when you think about Christianity.
Sure, but we've learned, or we've been taught, to have a slightly broader view of medieval European context. We need to, especially us who have an Iranian background, we need to think a little bit broader about medieval and pre-modern. This is pre-Safavid, and there is a difference. Certain things, the place of religion and what religion means in an Iranian context changes with the Safavids. This is pre-Safavid. It's quite different, and we are still suffering we are still suffering the consequences of the Safavid period. Sorry, the gentleman at the right.
If we accept the hypothesis of policy of that that is what is so interesting. So why is it that two great aspects of religion, poetry, are not, at least they do not seem to be followed by faith? Let me focus on one. The conspicuous insisting on using Persian language. did not really see that in Hafiz's
You mean
poetry.
linguistically?
Linguistically.
Yeah.
And let's focus on that.
Sure.
Another
But
thing that is
right.
equally important, and that's Ferdowsi's adherence to Iran, the old. Really, that seems to be shrinking.
I don't know. I mean, it's a, you're talking about someone who, Ferdowsi completes the Shahnameh in 1010. Hafiz dies in 1390. So a lot of things happen between 1010 and 1390, right? Nevertheless, I mean, it's not an impossible question to ask. I think you can turn it around and say, what is there about the project of Ferdowsi? I mean, we seem to accept what Ferdowsi does in the Shahnameh as though it were commonplace in his context, or as though he is representative of what is happening in New Persian poetry at the beginning of the 11th century. And he is not.
And he does not claim to be.
Sure, but it's an important point that I'm making, which is Ferdowsi is really the exception in many ways, not completely, but in many ways. Hafiz is very much, at the center of this big circle that I'm talking about, right? The other really important thing is that you're comparing one form with another form. You're comparing epic and romance poetry in Masnavi form with something that is ghazal and qasida. They really have very little to do with one another in terms of how poets use language within those forms to express ideas. And one is narrative and one is not. Yeah? One tells stories, and in ghazal, because these are very short, they point to stories, they remind you of things, they allude to things, they don't tell you stories normally. But sorry, let me talk about linguistically. What Ferdowsi did in the Shahnameh, which is why he really is an exception in many ways, and isn't a very important exception, but what he did in the Shahnameh in terms of how he used New Persian was not in keeping with the New Persian of the courts, by and large, and certainly not in keeping with the New Persian as used by lyric poets, who very freely used Arabic vocabulary. Ferdowsi deliberately and very much artificially avoided Arabic. Now he did that, I believe, because he was writing, I mean, it's a work that ends with the coming of Islam. He wants to sound authentic in some, obviously slightly manufactured way, but authentic in that everything he's talking about is from the beginning of time, which of course begins in Iran, to the coming of Islam. He doesn't want to use Arabic because he wants to use Persian in order to tell the stories of the Persian people and the Persian kings. But it's a very artificial process. It's not natural. And how you can see it's not natural is look at the way in which Rudaki, long before Ferdowsi, is using New Persian. It's full of Arabic. And they do not see the New Persian poets of the Samanid period, which is really Ferdowsi's period, the beginning of the Ghazalid. They don't see Arabic as something that is exterior to them as a literary language.
But it's hard to say what is
Natural in terms of literary language.
But it was after what is called 2 centuries of silence.
Yes, but that's also Ma'azirat Mukham. No, it's complete nonsense. 200 years of silence is, I'm sorry if you've had a talk on this before, but is utter nonsense.
But you can say it anyway.
Yes, that's true. It is not possible. It is not possible that Rudaki, who dies in 940 or 941, if you look at the poetry of Rudaki as far as we have it, with all the caveats about manuscripts and versions, variants and people fiddling with it and whatever. It is not possible that Rudaki could produce poetry at that level in New Persian if he were, and his circle were, the innovators of that literary language. It is impossible. There must have been, whether or not we have it in written form or not, and in fragmentary form, there must have been a century at least of New Persian lyric poetry before we have Rudaki.
But that was really to make the point. It was not that there was absolutely nothing whatsoever.
خب دو قرن سکوت یعنی هیچ کس نه حرف میزنه نه مینویسه و مهمتر از این نه فکر میکنه. فاقد ایرانی در اون دو قرن، معذرت میخوام، ایرانی در اون دو قرن اصلا فاقد خلاقیت، فاقد هویت. ما میتونیم این رو قبول بکنیم؟ دو قرن سکوت یعنی همین مات بودن، هیچی نمیگفتن. Well, that is the point, unfortunately. Anyway, we can talk about it later.
I think we're all out of time.
We are at yes.
Thank you.